The room was too quiet for what was about to happen. Hema stood near the tall windows, the city flickering behind her like a warning she had already ignored. She told herself she was here for money, for a reason she could fold neatly inside logic, but logic didn't explain why her hands trembled when the door opened. Arian walked in without hurry, a man who owned time and space just by breathing. He didn't look at her right away. He set down his phone, loosened his cufflinks, and only then let his gaze find her. It wasn't hunger. It was curiosity sharpened by power. "You understand what this means?" he asked, voice low, almost kind. She nodded. "I do." He studied her like she was something fragile pretending to be strong. The silence between them wasn't empty, it pulsed, alive, dangerous. When he stepped closer, the air changed. The distance shrank until she could see her reflection in his eyes. "Then say it," he murmured. She hesitated, then whispered, "It's just one night." He almost smiled. Nothing is ever just one night. Outside, the rain began to fall against the glass, and in that sound she felt the edge of something she didn't yet understand, fear tangled with a pull she didn't want to name. Later, when he walked away, she realized she couldn't remember what she had expected, only that she could still feel his presence long after he was gone. The morning after felt unreal, like she had stepped out of her own skin and forgotten where she'd left it. Hema went back to her classes, the same campus, the same friends who didn't notice the tremor in her laugh. She told herself it was done, that she could fold the memory into a corner of her mind and close it tight. But every reflection betrayed her, the way she adjusted her collar, the way her eyes lingered on expensive cars passing by. It wasn't shame that haunted her, it was the quiet certainty that something in her had shifted. At night, she dreamt of the echo of his voice, not his words, but the way they pressed against her restraint. She woke up angry, then afraid of why she wasn't angrier. Days later, she saw him again by accident, or maybe fate had been patient. He was sitting in a cafe, sunlight cutting through his sharp calm. He looked up as she passed, and for a moment neither pretended not to see. "You followed me?" she asked, heart steady but hands cold. "No," he said, a hint of amusement beneath the truth. "But I didn't leave, either." Their conversation was brief, sharp, too careful. He asked about her studies. She answered like she owed him nothing. Yet when he said her name before leaving, it felt like a thread pulling tight inside her. That night, she told herself she hated the way he said it. But she whispered it once in the dark, just to hear how it sounded when no one else could. It started with coincidence and turned into gravity. Hema began seeing him everywhere, sometimes across the marble lobby of a hotel where she passed for an interview, sometimes in the reflection of glass when a black car slowed near the sidewalk. She told herself it was her mind replaying his presence, but when he finally spoke again, it wasn't in a dream. "You shouldn't walk alone this late," Arian said one evening, his tone not gentle, not harsh, just inevitable. She turned, heart stumbling between fear and something else she didn't name. "I can take care of myself." "I know," he replied. "That's why you interest me." The words were wrong, but his voice wasn't. He didn't reach for her, didn't move closer, yet the distance between them felt fragile, like one breath could ruin it. They met again after that, once at a gallery, once outside a hospital where she volunteered. Each time, he said little, but his silence spoke of watching, of wanting to understand her beyond what he'd paid for. When she finally asked why he kept appearing, he said, "Because I don't like debts." She laughed without humor. "Then stop collecting mine." His eyes softened, but only slightly. "That's what I'm trying to do." And before she could reply, he brushed past her, his shoulder barely grazing hers, and it was enough to make her forget what air was supposed to feel like. That night, she sat on her bed, unable to decide if she wanted him to stop or to come closer. Both felt like losing. It happened on a night when the city was too bright to be honest. Hema had promised herself she wouldn't see him again, but promises had become fragile things in his orbit. He called once, said nothing, and somehow she ended up outside his penthouse anyway, telling herself she was there for closure. The door opened before she could knock. Arian stood there, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired in a way that made him look too human. "You came," he said simply, no surprise in his tone. "You called," she answered, trying to sound unaffected. The silence stretched, sharp as glass. Then he asked, "Do you regret it?" She wanted to say yes, but the word wouldn't form. "I don't know," she whispered. He stepped closer, and the air thickened between them. "You should," he murmured, not cruelly, just like someone who wished he could undo himself. She looked at him then, really looked, the weight on his shoulders, the guilt that lived in his eyes like a second heartbeat. "You think you're the only one allowed to drown," she said quietly. That broke something in him. "You don't understand what I ruined when I touched you," he said, voice low, almost breaking. She didn't answer. She just reached out, then stopped, her hand suspended inches from his chest. He looked down at it like it was both mercy and punishment. "Don't," he said. "If you do, I won't let you leave." The words weren't a threat, they were a confession. She stepped back, tears she didn't understand burning her eyes. When she finally turned to go, he didn't stop her. He only said her name once, softly, like an apology no one was meant to hear. Time didn't heal, it only learned how to hide. Weeks passed, and Hema tried to return to the quiet version of herself she'd known before him. She went to class, walked home the long way, cooked for one. But everywhere she turned, something carried his echo, the low hum of expensive engines on wet streets, the faint cologne of strangers in passing. At first, she fought it, told herself it was weakness. Then she realized it was something worse, longing. She missed the calm in his chaos, the way he looked at her like she was both a reminder and an answer. Arian buried himself in work, turned meetings into armor and silence into habit. His staff said he'd grown colder. He let them believe it. But at night, when the city outside went quiet, he found himself standing by the same window where she'd once stood, fingers brushing the glass as if touch could travel through memory. Once, he saw her across the street, just a glimpse, her hair caught in the wind. She didn't see him, or maybe she pretended not to. He didn't call out. He just watched her walk away until the crowd swallowed her. That night, he poured himself a drink, but couldn't finish it. Somewhere else, she stared at her phone, typing his number, then deleting it again. Neither of them slept. Neither of them stopped reaching for what wasn't there. It wasn't fate, it was exhaustion that brought them back together. Hema was leaving a late lecture when the rain started, sudden and unkind, and she ducked beneath the awning of a hotel she never could have afforded. She didn't see the black car until it stopped in front of her, didn't realize who stepped out until his voice cut through the storm. "You always find the rain," Arian said, his tone almost a smile, almost a wound. For a long moment she couldn't move. He looked different, colder, maybe lonelier, but his eyes still carried the same unbearable quiet. "You look fine," she said finally, trying to sound detached. "I'm not," he replied simply, stepping closer. "I don't think you are either." The rain fell harder, blurring the world until there was only them and the sound of what they hadn't said. "Why did you do it?" she asked, voice trembling. "Why buy me like that?" He took a long breath. "Because I thought control would keep me safe." She laughed softly, bitterly. "And now? Now I understand control was just another kind of cage." His eyes met hers, and for the first time he didn't look like the man who owned the world. He looked like a man terrified of losing something he'd never meant to find. "Say it," she whispered. He shook his head. "You already know." She stepped closer, close enough to see her reflection in his eyes again. "Then why are you still here?" she breathed. He didn't answer. He just looked at her the way people look at something they can't unlove. They didn't plan it, and maybe that's why it felt real. The storm had followed them to his penthouse, wrapping the windows in a restless hum. Neither spoke, they didn't need to. Hema moved to the window, tracing the drops with her fingertips, and Arian watched her from behind, his coat still damp, his breath shallow. When he finally walked to her, she didn't turn away. He reached past her to pull the curtains closed, but his hand lingered, fingers barely brushing her arm. It wasn't a demand, not even a question, just a pause long enough for both of them to feel what they'd been avoiding. She didn't move, and he exhaled like a man surrendering something he'd guarded too long. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. Neither should you, she whispered back. He looked at her then, really looked, the tired bravery in her eyes, the small tremor in her jaw. He lifted his hand, not to touch, but to rest it near her face, the air between them warm and shaking. She closed her eyes, and the distance disappeared, not through words, but through the fragile language of breath and heartbeat. When morning came, the world hadn't changed, but the silence had. She woke before him, the city still gray, his hand resting near hers, not holding, just there, like a promise they both knew they couldn't keep. She didn't wake him. She just watched, memorizing the peace that only came after breaking. Morning crept into the room like it was afraid to disturb them. The storm had passed, leaving only the faint hum of the city and the smell of rain still clinging to the air. Hema sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers tangled in the sheets, staring at the skyline that stretched beyond the glass. The light was soft, almost merciful, but it couldn't hide the ache beneath her calm. She thought of how everything began, a contract, a price, a choice she had convinced herself was survival, and how it had become this, something that felt nothing like what she'd sold. Arian stirred behind her, half awake, the kind of stillness that follows after a confession no one had the courage to say aloud. "You're leaving," he said quietly, not as a question. She turned, and for the first time, she saw him without the armor, no power, no control, just a man who had learned how to lose gracefully. "You always knew I would," she replied. He nodded once, as if he'd been preparing for that truth. She rose to leave, but paused at the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what it's worth, you didn't ruin me." He looked up then, his eyes tired but steady. "No," he said, "you saved me from what I already was." She walked out into the pale light, her heart heavier and freer all at once. Behind her, Arian sat alone, watching the rain start again, faint and slow, as if the sky itself didn't know how to let go. They would both go on broken in different ways, bound by something neither could name. And maybe, somewhere in that quiet ruin, there was a strange kind of love. Not perfect, not pure, but real enough to remember. We were never perfect. But in this darkness, we found something that felt real.